Hello and welcome to India Reads. I am Pradeep and we are reading an autobiography or the stories of my experiments with truth by Mahatma Gandhi. Just to give you a recap, we had reached a point where Mahatma Gandhi reaches England. He is struggling with money. He stays in a fancy hotel which costs him a lot of money, and then he moves into another place which was almost in ruins. And then, on the suggestion of his uh, advisor, Mr. Mehta, he moves into a Sindhi family where he's still struggling with food. He is very adamant that he would not forsake his vow of vegetarianism, and that's where we left the chapter. So let's start with this section. But I had found my feet now. I had not yet started upon my regular studies. I had just begun reading newspapers thanks to Sergeant Shukla. In India, I had never read a newspaper, but here I succeeded in cultivating a liking for them by regular reading. I always glanced over the Daily News, the Daily Telegraph, and the Pall Mall Gazette. This took me hardly an hour. I therefore began to wander about. I launched out in search of a vegetarian restaurant. The landlady had told me that there were such places in the city. I would trot 10 or 12 miles each day, go into a cheap restaurant and eat my fill of bread, but would never be satisfied. During these wanderings, I once hit on a vegetarian restaurant in Farringdon Street. The sight of it filled me with the same joy that a child feels on getting a thing after its own heart. Before I entered, I noticed books for sale exhibited under a glass window near the door. Among them, I saw Salt's Pleas for Vegetarianism. This I purchased for a shilling and went straight to the dining room. This was my first hearty meal since my arrival in England. God had come to my aid. I read Salt's book from cover to cover and was very much impressed by it. From the date of reading this book, I am claimed to have become a vegetarian by choice. I blessed the day on which I had taken the vow before my mother. I had all along abstained from meat in the interest of truth and of the vow that I had taken, but had wished at the same time that every Indian should be a meat eater and look forward for being one myself clearly and openly one day, and to enlisting others in the cause. The choice was now made in favor of vegetarianism, the spread of which henceforward became my mission. Playing the English gentleman. My faith in vegetarianism grew on me day to day. Salt's book whetted my appetite for dietetic studies. I went in for all the books available on vegetarianism and read them. Of these, Howard Williams' The Ethics of Diet was a biographical history of the literature of human dietetics from the earliest period to the present day. I try to make out that all philosophers and prophets of the Pythagoras and Jesus down to those of the present age were vegetarians. Dr. Anna Kingsford, The Perfect Way in Diet was also an attractive book. Dr. Allinson's writings on health and hygiene were likewise very helpful. He advocated a curative system based on regulation of the dietary of patients. Himself a vegetarian, he prescribed for his patients also a strictly vegetarian diet. The result of reading all this literature was that dietetic experiments came to take an important place in my life. Health was the physical consideration of these experiments to begin with, but later on religion became the supreme motive. Meanwhile, my friend had not ceased to worry about me. His love for me led him to think that I had persisted in my objection to meat eating. I should not only that if I persisted in my objections to meat eating, I should not only develop a weak constitution but also remain a duffer, because I should never feel at home in English society. When he came to know that I had begun to interest myself in books on vegetarianism, he was afraid lest these studies should muddle my head and I should fritter away my life in these experiments, forgetting my own work and become a crank. He therefore made one last effort to reform me. He one day invited me to go to the theatre before the play. We were to dine together at Holborn Restaurant, to me a palatial palace and the first big restaurant I had been to since leaving the Victoria Hotel. The stay at that hotel had scarcely been a helpful experience, for I had not lived there with my wits about me. The friend had planned to take me to this restaurant, evidently imagining that modesty would forbid any questions. And it was very big company of diners, in the midst of which my friend and I sat, sharing a table between us. The first course was soup. I wondered what it might be made of. but dared not to ask the friend about it. I therefore summoned the waiter. My friend saw the moment and sternly asked across the table what was the matter. With considerable hesitation, I told him that I wanted to inquire if the soup was vegetarian. "You are too clumsy for decent society," he passionately exclaimed. "If you cannot behave yourself, you had better go. Feed in some other restaurant and await me outside." This delighted me, so out I went. There was a vegetarian restaurant close by and it was closed. So I went without food that night. I accompanied my friend to the theatre, but he never said a word about the scene I had created. On my part, of course, there was nothing to say. And that was the last friendly tussle we had. It did not affect our relations in the least. I could see and appreciate the love with which my friend's efforts were actuated, and my respect for him was all the greater on account of our differences in thought and action. But I decided that I should put him at ease, that I should assure him that I would be clumsy no more, but try and become more polished and make up for my vegetarianism by cultivating other accomplishments which fitted one for polite society. And for this purpose, I undertook the all too important task of becoming an English gentleman. The clothes after the Bombay cut that I was wearing were, I thought, unsuitable for English society, and I got new ones at the Army and Navy stores. I also went for chimney pot hat costing 19 shillings, an excessive price in those days. Not content with this, I wasted £10 on an evening suit made in Wall Street, the center of fashionable life in London, and got my good and noble-hearted brother to send me a double watch chain of gold. It was not the correct way to wear a ready-made tie, and I learned the art of tying it myself. While in India, the mirror had been a luxury permitted on days when my family barber gave me a shave. Here, I wasted 10 minutes every day before the huge mirror, watching myself arranging my tie and parting my hair in the correct fashion. My hair was by no means soft, and every day it meant a regular struggle with the brush to keep it in position. Each time the hat was put on and off, the hair would automatically move towards the head to adjust the head. The hand would move towards the head to adjust the hair. Not to mention the other civilized habit of the hand every now and then operating for the same purpose while sitting in the polished society. And if this were not enough to make me look the thing, I directed my attention to other details that were supposed to go towards making of an English gentleman. I was told it was necessary for me to take lessons in dancing, French, and elocution. French was not only the language of neighboring France, but it was also the lingua franca of the continent over which I had desired to travel. I decided to take dancing classes at a class and paid down £3 as fees for a term. I must have taken about 6 lessons in 3 weeks. It was beyond me to achieve anything like a rhythmic motion. I could not follow the piano and hence found it impossible to keep time. What then was I to do? The recluse in the fable kept a cat to keep off rats, and then a cow to feed the cat with milk, and a man to keep the cow, and so on. My ambitions also grew like the family of the recluse. So I thought I should learn to play the violin to cultivate an ear for Western music. So I invested £3 in a violin and something more in fees. I sought a third teacher to give me lessons in elocution and paid him a preliminary fee of a guinea. He recommended Bell's Standard Elocution as a textbook, which I purchased, and I began with a speech of Pitt's. But Mr. Bell rang a bell of alarm in my ear, and I awoke. I had not to spend a lifetime in England, I said to myself. What then was the use of learning elocution, and how could dancing make a gentleman of me? The violin I could learn even in India. I was a student and ought to go on with my studies. I should qualify myself and join the Inns of the Court. If my character made a gentleman of me, so much the better. Otherwise, I should forego the ambition. These and similar thoughts possessed me, and I expressed themselves in a letter which I addressed to the elocution teacher, requesting him to excuse me for any further lessons. I had taken only 2 or 3. I wrote a similar letter to the dancing teacher and went personally to the violin teacher with the request to dispose of the violin for any price it might fetch. She was rather friendly to me, so I told her now that I had discovered I was pursuing a false idea. She encouraged me in the determination to make a complete change. This infatuation might have lasted about 3 months. The punctiliousness in the dress persisted for years. Henceforward I became a student. Changes. Let no one imagine that my experiments in dancing and the like marked a stage of indulgence in my life. The reader would have noticed that even then I had my wits about me. That period of infatuation was not unrelieved by a certain amount of self-introspection in my part. I kept account of every farthing I spent, and my expenses were carefully calculated. Every little item, such as the omnibus fares or the postage or a couple of coppers spent on newspapers, would be entered and the balance struck every evening before going to bed. That habit has stayed with me ever since, and I know this as a result. Even though I've had to handle public funds amounting to lakhs, I have succeeded in exercising strict economy in their disbursement, and instead of outstanding debts, have had invariably a surplus balance in respect of all the moments I've led. Let every you take a leaf out of my notebook and make it a point to account for everything that comes into and goes out of his pocket. And like me, he is sure to be a gainer at the end. As I kept a strict watch over my way of living, I could see that it was necessary to economize. I therefore decided to reduce my expenses by half. My accounts showed numerous items spent on fares. Again, my living with a family meant the payment of a regular weekly bill. It also included the courtesy of occasionally taking members of the family out to dinner and likewise attending parties with them. All this involved heavy items for conveyances, especially as if the friend was a lady, custom required that the man should pay all the expenses. Also, dining out meant extra cost as no deduction could be made from the regular weekly bill for meals not taken. It seemed to me that all these items could be saved, as likewise the drain on my purse caused through a false sense of propriety. So I decided to take the rooms on my own account instead of living any longer in a family, and also to remove from place to place according to work. I had to do so, thus gaining experience at the same time. I guess this move from place to place. The rooms were so selected as to enable me to reach the place of business on foot in half an hour and so save fares. Before this, I had always taken some kind of conveyance wherever I went, whenever I went anywhere, and had to find extra time for walks. The new arrangement combined walks and economy, and it meant a sharing of fares and gave me walks of 8 to 10 miles a day. It was mainly this habit of long walks that kept me particularly free from illness throughout my stay in England, and it gave me a fairly strong body. Thus, I rented a suite of rooms, one for a sitting room, another for a bedroom. This was the second stage, the third was yet to come. And these changes saved me half the expense. But how was I to utilize the time? I knew that the bar examinations did not require much study. I therefore did not feel pressed for time. My weak English was a perpetual worry to me. Mr. Afterwards Sir Frederick Lely's word, graduate first and then come to see me, still rang in my ears. I should, I thought, not only be called to the bar but have some literary degree as well. I inquired about the Oxford and Cambridge University courses, consulted a few friends, and found that if I elected to go to either of these places, that would mean greater expense and a much longer stay in England than I was prepared for. A friend suggested that if I really wanted to have the satisfaction of taking a difficult examination, I should pass the London matriculation. It meant a good deal of labour and much addition to my stock of general knowledge without any extra expense worth the name. I welcomed the suggestion, but the syllabus frightened me. Latin and a modern language were compulsory. How was I supposed to manage Latin? But the friend entered a strong plea for it. Latin is very valuable to lawyers. Knowledge of Latin is very useful in understanding law books. One paper in Roman law is entirely in Latin. Besides, a knowledge of Latin means a greater command over the English language. It went home and I decided to learn Latin no matter how difficult it might be. French I had already begun, and so I thought that should be the modern language. I joined a private matriculation class. Examinations were held every 6 months, and I had only 5 months at my disposal. It was almost an impossible task for me, but the aspirant, after being an English gentleman, chose to convert himself into a serious student. I framed my own timetable to the minute, but neither my intelligence nor my memory promised to enable me to tackle Latin and French besides other subjects within the given period. The result was that I ploughed in Latin. I was sorry but did not lose heart. I had acquired a taste for Latin, and I also thought my French would be all the better for another trial, and I would select a new subject in the science group. Chemistry was my subject in science, and I had no attraction for want of experiments, whereas it ought to have been a deeply interesting study. It was one of the compulsory subjects in India, and so I had selected it for the London matriculation. This time, however, I chose heat and light instead of chemistry. It was said to be easy, and I found it to be so. With my preparation for another trial, I made an effort to simplify my life still further. I felt that my way of living did not yet befit the modern means of my family. The thought of my struggling brother who nobly responded to my regular calls for monetary help deeply pained me. I saw that most of those who were spending from 8 to 15 pounds monthly had the advantage of scholarships. I had before me examples of much simpler living. I came across a fair number of poor students living more humbly than I. One of them was staying in the slums in a room for 2 shillings a week and living on 2 pence worth of cocoa and bread per meal from Lockhart's cheap cocoa rooms. It was far from me to think of emulating him, but I felt I could surely have one room instead of two and cook some of my meals at home. That would be a saving of 4 to 5 pounds every month. I came across books on simple living. I gave up the suite of rooms and rented one instead, invested in a stove, and began cooking my breakfast at home. The process scarcely took me more than 20 minutes, for there was only oatmeal porridge to cook and water to boil for cocoa. I had lunch outside and dinner bread and cocoa at home. Thus I managed to live on a shilling and 3 pence a day. This was also a period of intensive study. Plain living saved me plenty of time and I passed my examination. Let not the reader think that this living made my life by any means a dreary affair. On the contrary, the change harmonized my inward and outward life. It was also more in keeping in time with the means of my family. My life was certainly more truthful and my soul knew no bonds of joy. My experiments in dietetics. As I searched myself deeper, the necessity for change, both internal and external, began to grow onto me. As soon as, or even before, I made alterations in my expenses and my way of living, I began to make changes in my diet. I saw that the writers of vegetarianism had examined the question very minutely, attacking it in its religious, scientific, practical, and medical aspects. Ethically, they had arrived at the conclusion that man's supremacy over the lower animals meant not that the former should prey upon the latter, but the higher should protect the lower, and there should be mutual aid between the two as man and man. They had also brought out the truth that man eats not for the enjoyment but to live, and some of them accordingly suggested and effected in their life abstention not only from flesh meat but also from eggs and milk. Scientifically, some had concluded that man's physical structure showed that he was not meant to be a cooking but a frugivorous animal that could only take his mother's milk, and as soon as he had teeth should begin to take solid foods. Medically, they had suggested the rejection of all spices and condiments. According to the practical and economic argument, they had demonstrated that a vegetarian diet was the least expensive. All these considerations had their effect on me, and I came across vegetarians of all these types in vegetarian restaurants. There was a Vegetarian Society of England with a weekly journal of its own. I subscribed to the weekly, joined the society, and shortly found myself on the executive committee. Here I came into contact with those who were regarded as the pillars of vegetarianism and began my own experiment in dietetics. I stopped taking the sweets and condiments I had got from home, the mind having taken a different turn. The fondness for condiments wore away, and I now relished the boiled spinach, which in Richmond tasted insipid, cooked without condiments. Many such experiments taught me that the real seat of taste was not the tongue but the mind. The economic consideration was of course constantly upon me. There was in those days a body of opinion which regarded tea and coffee as harmful and favoured cocoa. But as I was convinced that one should eat only articles that sustain the body, I gave up tea and coffee as a rule and substituted cocoa. There were two divisions in the restaurants I used to visit. One division, which was patronized by fairly well-to-do people, prompted any number of courses from which one chose and paid for a la carte, each dinner thus costing from 1 to 2 shillings. The other division provided 6 penny dinners of 3 courses with a slice of bread. In my days of strict frugality, I usually dined in the second division. There were many minor experiments going on along with the main one, as for example giving up on starchy foods at one time, living on bread and fruit alone at the other, and once living on cheese, milk and eggs. The last experiment is worth noting. It lasted not even for the fortnight. The reformer who advocated starchless food had spoken highly of eggs and held that eggs were not meat. It was apparent that there was no injury done to the living creatures in taking eggs. I was taken in by the spleen and took eggs in spite of my vow, but the lapse was momentary. I had no business in putting a new interpretation on the vow. The interpretation of my mother, who had administered the vow, was there for me. I knew that her definition of meat included eggs, and as soon as I saw the true import of the vow, I gave up the eggs and the experiment alike. There is a nice point underlying the argument and worth noting. I came across three definitions of meat in England. According to the first, meat denoted only the flesh of birds and beasts. Vegetarians who accepted this definition abjured the flesh of birds and beasts but ate fish, not to mention eggs. According to the second definition, meat meant flesh of all living creatures, so fish was here out of the question, but eggs were allowed. The third definition included under meat the flesh of all living beings as well as their products, thus covering eggs and milk alike. If I accepted the first division, I could take not only eggs but the fish also. But here I was convinced that my mother's definition was a definition binding on me. If therefore I would observe the vow I had taken, I must abjure eggs. I therefore did so. But this was hardship inasmuch as the inquiry showed that even in vegetarian restaurants, many courses used to contain eggs. This meant unless I knew what was what, I had to go through the awkward process of ascertaining whether a particular course contained eggs or no, for many puddings and cakes were not free from them. But though the revelation of my duty caused this difficulty, I simplified my food. The simplification in its turn brought me annoyance in that I had to give up several dishes I had come to relish. These difficulties were only passing, for the strict observance of the vow produced an inward relish distinctly more healthy, delicate, and permanent. The real ordeal was, however, still yet to come, and this was in respect of another vow. But who dare harm those whom God protects? A few observations about the interpretations of it and of vows and pledges may not be out of place here. Interpretation of pledges had been a fruitful source of strife all the world over. No matter how explicit the pledge, people would turn and twist the text to suit their own purposes. They are to be met among all classes of society, from the rich down to the poor, from the prince down to the peasant. Selfishness turns them blind, and by use of ambiguous middle they deceive themselves and seek to deceive the world and God. One golden rule is to accept the interpretation honestly put on the pledge by partly administering it. Another is to accept the interpretation of the weaker party where there are two interpretations possible. Rejection of these two rules gives rise to strife and iniquity, which are rooted in untruthfulness. He who seeks truth alone easily follows the golden rule. He need not seek learned advice for interpretation. My mother's interpretation of meat was, according to the golden rule, the only true one for me, and not the one my wider experience or my pride of better knowledge might have taught me. My experiments in England were conducted from the point of view of economy and hygiene. The religious aspect of the question was not considered until I went to South Africa, where I undertook strenuous experiments which will be narrated later. The seed, however, for all of them was sown in England. A convert's enthusiasm for his new religion is greater than that of a person who is born in it. Vegetarianism was then a new cult in England, and likewise for me, because as we have seen, I had gone there as a convinced meat eater and was intellectually converted into vegetarianism later. Full of a neophyte zeal for vegetarianism, I decided to start a vegetarian club in my locality, Bayswater. I invited Sir Edwin Arnold, who lived there, to be the vice president. Dr. Oldfield was the editor of the Vegetarian, became president. I myself became the secretary. The club went well for a while but came to an end in the course of a few months, for I left the locality according to my custom of moving from place to place periodically. But this brief and modest experience gave me some little training in organizing and conducting institutions. Shyness my shield. I was elected to the executive committee of the Vegetarian Society and made it a point to attend every one of its meetings, but I always felt tongue-tied. Dr. Oldfield once told me, "You talk to me quite all right, but what is it that you never open your lips at a committee meeting? You are a drone." I appreciated the banter. The bees are ever busy. The drone is a thorough idler. And it was not a little curious that whilst others expressed their opinion at these meetings, I sat quite silent. Not that I ever felt tempted to speak, but I was at loss to know how to express myself. All the rest of the members appeared to me as to be better informed than I. Then it often happened that just when I had mustered up courage to speak, a fresh subject would be started. This went on for a long time. Meanwhile, a serious question came up for discussion. I thought it would be wrong to be absent and felt it cowardice to register a silent vote. The decision arose somewhat in this wise. The president of the society was Mr. Hills, proprietor of Thames Iron Works. He was a Puritan. It might be said that the existence of the society depended practically on his financial assistance. Many members of the committee were more or less his prodigies. Dr. Allinson of the vegetarian fame was also a member of the committee. He was an advocate of the then new birth control movement and preached its methods among the working classes. Dr. Hills regarded these methods as cutting the roots of the morals. He thought that the vegetarian society had for its object not the dietetic but also moral reform, and a man of Dr. Allinson's anti-Puritanistic views should not be allowed to remain in the society. A motion therefore was brought for his removal. The question deeply interested me. I consider Dr. Allison's views regarding artificial methods of birth control as dangerous, and I believe that Dr. Hills was entitled as a Puritan to oppose him. I had high regard for Dr. Hills and his generosity, but I thought it was quite improper to exclude a man from a vegetarian society because he refused to regard Puritan view works as one of the objects of Puritan morals as one of the objects of society. Dr. Hill's view regarding the exclusion of anti-Puritans from the society was a personal one. It had nothing to do with the declared objective of the society, which was simply the promotion of vegetarianism and not of any system of morality. I therefore held that any vegetarian could be a member of the society irrespective of his views or other morals. There were in the committee others who shared my view, but I felt myself personally called upon to express my own. How to do it was a question. I had not the courage to speak. I therefore decided to set my thoughts in writing. I went to the meeting with the document in my pocket. So far as I recollect, I could not find myself equal even reading it, and the president had it read by someone else. Dr. Allison lost the day. This in the first battle of the kind I found myself siding with the losing party, but I had the comfort in the thought that the cause was right. I have faint recollection after this incident I resigned from the committee. The shyness I retained throughout my stay in England, even when I paid a social call, the presence of half a dozen or more people would strike me dumb. I often went to Ventnor with Sergeant Majumdar. We stayed there with a vegetarian family. Mr. Howard, the author of Ethics of Diet, was also staying at the same watering place. We met him and he invited us to speak at the meeting for the promotion of vegetarianism. I ascertained that it was not considered incorrect to read one's speech. I knew that many did so to express themselves coherently and briefly. To speak extempore would have been out of the question for me. I had therefore written down my speech. I stood up to read it, but I could not. My vision blurred and I trembled, though the speech hardly covered a sheet of foolscap. Sergeant Majumdar had to read it for me. His own speech was of course excellent and received with applause. I was ashamed of myself and sad at heart for my incapacity. My last effort to make a public speech in England was on the eve of my departure from home. By this time I had not only succeeded in making myself ridiculous, I invited my vegetarian friends to dinner at Holborn restaurant referred to in these chapters. A vegetarian dinner could be had, I said to myself, in vegetarian restaurants as a matter of choice. Why should it not be possible in a non-vegetarian restaurant too? I arranged with the manager of Holborn restaurant to provide for a strictly vegetarian meal. The vegetarians hailed the new experiment with delight. All diners were, were meant for enjoyment, but in the West has developed the thing into an art. They are celebrated with great eclat, music and speeches. And the little dinner party that I gave was also not unaccompanied by such displays. Speeches therefore had to be. When my turn came, when my turn for speaking came, I stood up to make a speech. I had with great care thought of out one which should consist of a few sentences. But I could not proceed beyond the first sentence. I had read of the Addison that he began his maiden speech in the House of Commons repeating, "I conceived" 3 times, and when he could proceed no further, a wag stood up and said, "This gentleman conceived thrice, but brought forth nothing." I had thought of making a humorous speech by taking this anecdote as a text. I therefore began with it and stuck there. My memory entirely failed me, and in attempting a humorous speech, I made myself ridiculous. "I thank you, gentlemen, for having responded to my invitation," I said abruptly, and I sat down. It was only in South Africa that I got over the shyness, though I never completely overcame it. It was impossible for me to speak impromptu. I hesitated whenever I had to face strange audiences and avoided making a speech whenever I could. Even today, I do not think I could or would be inclined to keep a meeting of friends engaged in idle talk. Okay, with this, I would take a break and we will continue from this section in the next video. So what do we have here to unpack? Primarily, whatever we've read has kindly mainly consists of Gandhi's mainly consists of two aspects. One is his passion and pursuit of becoming an English gentleman. Second is his pursuit of holding on to a vegetarian diet. Let's look at the first one. So Gandhi realizes that if he has to do well in England, he has to become an English gentleman. So he starts by investing in the right kind of clothes. He gets a hat. He gets his brother to send him a watch from India with a gold chain around it. He then realizes that he needs to learn dancing. He needs to learn French. He needs to when he goes for dancing, he realizes he doesn't have flair for or an ear for Western music, and he realizes for that he needs to learn music, and therefore invests in violin classes. As he proceeds, he realizes that he becomes like a recluse who uh, realizes that he's got a rat, and he invests in a cat to get rid of the rat, and then the cat needs milk, so he invests in a cow, and so on and so forth. And he realizes he has this sudden moment of realization that he is not supposed to be staying in England forever, and he's come there with a purpose, and the purpose was to get a degree, and all these distractions therefore need to be cut off, and slowly he starts cutting off one after the other. He sells his violin for whatever price he gets. He writes a letter to the teacher who was teaching him elocution. He writes a letter to his dance teacher, and he cuts off all these classes. With his entry into the bar, he realizes that if he works hard, he will be able to get through. So he decides to take another course. The course is in literature, because he is reminded of the opportunity that he's got in Porbandar, where Mr. Lely tells him that he should graduate in England and he would then be offered a good job. So he does a course in literature. He's in the London matriculation, and as part of the London matriculation, he needs to learn Latin. He's initially scared about learning Latin. He wonders how it will help him in life, but some of his friends advise him that Latin is the language that lawyers should know, and he should take an additional course on Roman law, and uh, and that it would help him in his future. And so he does that course, and he does well in that. Uh, Now let's go to the second part. The second part is about vegetarianism. Gandhi maintains, or rather keeps up with his vow of not eating any kind of meat, that the promise that he has made to his mother way back in India, and that is obviously something that his close friend does not like. His close friend takes him to invites him to the theater one evening and takes him to one very fancy restaurant, and the first course of course is soup, and Gandhi kind of hesitates. He realizes that if he avoids a confrontation of asking his friend, so he asks the waiter. The friend stops him from asking the waiter and says that if he has any issue he should walk out. Gandhi obviously walks out and looks for a vegetarian restaurant. He's not able to find one, but he decides to stay hungry, and they go back to theater after that. This, however, does not affect his friendship. The friend also realizes that Gandhi wants to stay vegetarian, and he realizes that the friend has his good interests in his heart. But he takes his vegetarianism very seriously. He's not somebody who any which ways wanted to be vegetarian. He felt that he would start eating meat after his parents pass. Parents are no longer there, and he wanted all of India to eat meat to stand up to the British. But this whole new wave of vegetarianism in England takes him also over. He invests in books understanding vegetarianism and understanding the concept of vegetarianism, which not only includes all meat and fish but also eggs and milk, and therefore he's confused about it. So in England he realizes there are these three sections. The first section is all meat excluding fish. The second is all meat and fish. The third being all meat, fish, eggs and milk. So then he realizes and he tries the egg combination, and and then he does it for a while, and then the realization hits him that this is not what his mother would have liked. And in his mother's book, eating egg is non-vegetarian, and so he gives up on that also. However, he does not stop drinking milk because he goes by his mother's definition of vegetarianism. Now he takes it so passionately that he starts reading books. He joins committees which are on vegetarianism. He creates his own vegetarian society. At this period also, Gandhi is moving from house to house. He tries and keeps his apartment as close as possible, about 8 to 10 miles from his place of work, so that he can walk for 30 minutes and reach the place, and also not spend any money on public transportation. So uh, it serves three purposes. One is that he's able to save money. Two is it gives him a lot of fitness, and three is he's able to experience different parts of London. He's experiencing different localities as he moves from place to place to place. And one of the places he creates this vegetarian society, for which he gets a vice president, he gets a president of the society, and he appoints himself as a secretary. The whole experience of saving money, every pence, every farthing, helps him in managing a society also. And he realizes it helped him much later in life, when he had to manage large movements with a lot of public funds. Every saving that he does, and every moment that he had created, he had not run into debts, in fact had surplus money. uh, what else is there in this chapter? The chapter ends, or rather, my reading ends with his writing about his shyness to speak. So while he was the secretary of the Vegetarian Society, he would not do a lot of public speaking. In fact, he did not do any kind of public speaking because he was shy. He would be tongue tied in most places. So he started realizing that he could possibly write and read it out in many places. On his farewell, which is his last day in England, there was a lunch which was given in his honor, and he decided to get up and write a speech. The speech did not go very well, but it kind of gave him a lesson of why he was lacking. So that's about where we're going to stop for this chapter. I hope that you're enjoying these readings. I hope that you're getting to know a lot more of Gandhi. And if you have any comments, any suggestions, please drop it in the comment section below. I look forward to seeing you in the next chapter. Till then, have a lovely evening. Bye bye.